Assalamu alaikum. Today I happened to come across this slide, a pre-made slide on Peter Barry's Psychoanalytic Criticism. I thought would make use of these slides for completing the entire chapter in one go. Okay, so maybe after model exams we can have another session where we can discuss some of the case studies that are missing here, but for an overall view of the chapter, this ought to serve the purpose. Okay, so brief recap of what we've done so far. As far as the entire overview of this chapter is concerned, it focuses on Freud and Lacan. Okay, Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan, theories of both the psychoanalysts and their criticism. And even though both belong to the psychoanalytic field, and both their ideas emerge from the same set of theories to begin with, they are vastly different. You would find that their interpretation, their application of the techniques of psychoanalysis to literary criticism is entirely worlds apart. Okay, so what does psychoanalytic criticism do? We've already discussed that it is the interpretation. The psychoanalytic criticism is the use of psychoanalytic techniques of psychoanalysis applied in the interpretation of literature. And what do the psychoanalysis? What does psychoanalysis do? Psychoanalysis aims to cure mental disorders by investigating the interaction of the conscious and unconscious elements in our mind or in our being as such. So Sigmund Freud, we've already seen, is an Austrian psychoanalyst who's so revered, and a whole community has been formed, fan following is formed, and mainly because his projection of the unconscious. So to begin with, he started with the idea that our mind, our self, is composed of two distinct parts, the conscious and the unconscious. And later on, he devised the three-model theory of the superego, ego, and id, where the superego would be our conscience that helps us discriminate or to differentiate between right and wrong. Ego would be our conscious being, while the id would be the unconscious part of ourself. Now, this unconscious part of self, though it remains hidden most of the time, it finds its outlet in every action we do. So, some of the key concepts of Freud were discussed earlier, in terms of sublimation, condensation, transference, projection. All of these were discussed earlier. Yeah, there is a mention of screen memory, a trivial or consequential memory to obliterate more significant one. We've already discussed all of it. Freudian slip, how we tend to inadvertently, how the unconscious seems to make its presence felt, make its presence known through various actions, bungled actions. Okay, so that's what Freud calls Freudian slip. There is this one lovely example in your in your book on Peter Barry, a book by Peter Barry, wherein Freud gives practical deduction, use this deductive method to analyze how every slip of the tongue or the slip of the pen or some bungled action has its origin in some repressed memory or some repressed desire or fear in the unconscious. So he happens to be traveling with this one person who and both of them get involved in this heated debate about how the Jews were castrated and they were prevented from from taking up legitimate jobs, and how they were obvious obstacles were laid in front of them so as to hinder their progress in any field for that matter. And this person who's traveling with who's debating with Freud, who's arguing with Freud, he makes mention of this one particular sentence, one quote from Diderot's Carthage. And I mean, and this sentence, this quote, he he bungles this quote. He bungles this quote as in he misses this one particular word out of that quote. A quote. This word, this slippage, when pointed out by Freud, the person talking to him, he says, "Well, you believe that that you can find the origin, or you claim to um, you claim that every action, every slippage has its origin in some repressed desire, memory, or fear, right? So tell me, what is it that my slippage implies? What is the implication of it? What is the source of it? Do I have some repressed memory or desire or fear that has caused the slippage? Now, now Freud tells him to say words just about anything, or or relate some recent experiences at a random state. So he makes mention of a certain file kept in a certain saint's which contains a certain saint's blood, which is liquefies every month, or a particular period every year. And when it does not liquefy, it seems to create a great deal of anxiety in the people of that region. And again, he speaks of some certain saints, Saint Aquarius and Saint Januarius. Oh yeah. And then he does mention a few events, inconsequential events or random events at best, and Freud seems to immediately connect them all together to show him the source of anxiety, or the repressed, or probably not fear exactly, the anxiety or the unease inherent in that person, that has caused the slippage. So it is rather interesting to note all of it. I request you to do a detailed study of it after the model exams. For now, it ought to be enough that you can condense a series of thought processes, and arrive at one simple conclusion. But sometimes, as Freud says, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. It does not have any symbolic significance to it. A slippage might just be a lapse of thought. It need not have its origin every time in some repressed thought, fear, or some emotion, right? So this Freudian slip is very interesting to note. And then the dream work, condensation and displacement, we've discussed in terms of the Roman soldier in the last class, how the father figure is turned into this Roman soldier for its patriarchal authority, all right? And how a series of events could be condensed into one single memory or one single dream. And besides, apart from that, there are certain points which are not taken favorably by many critics, especially female feminist critics for that matter, because because Freud seems to lay much stock by his assumption that women envy men for certain reasons, and hence we find ourselves lacking most of the time, and this envy causes various mental disorders and disruptions in our mental well-being. So it's of course it's ridiculous in my point of view. Yeah. So moving on, I'm sorry. So what the Freudian critics do is they try to stress the distinction between conscious and unconscious. They try to show unconscious motives of each character in any work, and try to reflect upon how these unconscious the repressed emotions of the unconscious manifest themselves in their actions. And seeing in the literary work, they try to see in the literary work an embodiment of classic psychoanalytic conditions. So the various stages, the stages of for instance, Oedipus complex, or how there is mention made of Hamlet, and a certain manifestation of Oedipus complex in his hesitation in trying to avenge his father's death, his father's murder. Sorry. And again, there is a mention made of one of Pinter's plays, a sort of surrealist, abstract play where there is a family of all, a patriarchal family of all, an all male family, where this one of the sons' wife is made to work as a prostitute, and the proceeds gained by her would be taken up by these people, the men in the family, the father and the other two sons. So, well, a certain Freudian analysis would probably help us understand why this degradation in eroticism is considered necessary, and how it seems to manifest itself from a sense of mother fixation that has occurred because of the absence of a mother figure there. Absence of a mother figure, as in the how this mother figure, the mother in the family, is revered to the point of worshipping, and how any woman they involve in sexually need to be degraded so as to have any relations with. So, well, of course, Freud mainly considers these ideas, the any action for that matter, in a rather perverse way, so which are almost ridiculous. I mean, in my opinion, it is ridiculous. Well, it's a general consensus. There is a general consensus that uh, his ideas are extremely abstract and sometimes disagreeable, extremely unpleasant, and morally corrupt. Of course, there is also another example of a case study of this patient who committed suicide at some point, and who was given treatment by Freud, and she seems to have related some of her dreams that are recorded in as a case study in Freud's works, amongst Freud's works. So this case study of Dora again goes through some of the same lines, along the same lines, as to this reverse Oedipus complex. Well, we wouldn't try to go into too many details because first of all, for the lack of time, and second of all, for its utter ridiculousness of it all. Well, I'm entitled to my view, I believe. Anyway, so moving on, the second psychoanalyst, Jacques Lacan. His ideas, though they stem from Freudian theories of the conscious and the unconscious, he did diverge away from the basic assumption that the unconscious stays somewhere unbidden, unhidden, and tries to find its outlet at some points during extreme stress or some carelessness. It emerges out in some of the actions. Lacan diverges in this sense that he believes that the unconscious itself is the central kernel of our being. Okay, he of course accepts the distinction between the conscious and the unconscious as proposed by Freud. But then Freud did not accord the unconscious the same kind of importance, the same kind of centrality as accorded by Lacan, right? So Lacan believes that it is the central nucleus of our being. So, and also he says that it is not as chaotic as Freud or all the Freudian critics seem to believe. Lacan feels that our unconscious is not chaotic at all, it's not messy at all, it is structured, it is a well structured construct like language. Like language, in the sense that language tends to be structured unit, a complete structured unit, wherein a person enters, makes use of it, and goes out. The same way, the unconscious seems to be a well structured construct which is more important than anything else. The exterior, the conscious is where it's extremely superficial. It just makes use of the unconscious, which is complete and whole in itself. Okay, so the very question of individual selfhood is made doubtful now. It's frowned upon by Lacan and followers of Lacan. So the famous idiom, the famous adage, "I think, therefore I am," as proposed by the philosopher Descartes, is now at the hands of Lacan turned into "I am where I think where I think not." As in, I am in a place where I am consciously not. So you see, Lacan believes that we are unaware of the contents of our being. We cannot say for sure what resides within us. We make use of whatever seems to be made available at that time for us to make use of, but no man can be sure of his own persona, his own self, his own unconscious at any point of time. So I am where I think not. So thinking is a conscious process, whereas the unconscious is the entire being of us. Okay, so he rejected the conventional view of characterization in literature because of this. So Lacanian criticism goes through these lines. It mainly opposes the idea that there can be a well-rounded characterization possible in any work, because for a character to be understood, you need to understand its kernel, it's what it is composed of, what it is made of. And the composition of a person is indefinite, it is indefinable, it is unknowable, right? Even though it is well structured, it is not well known. The contents of our unconscious is completely hidden. Okay, completely hidden in the sense, even though it is central to our being, central to all the actions, motives, everything, the contents of it is not known. So he feels, as I said earlier, language is a complete construct. It's a well structured construct which we enter into and leave. So it is constructed before we enter it. It's not as if we go and construct it. Language is a complete construct in and of itself. All right. So this analogy that he uses of language, this analogy for the unconscious self, leads him to speculate about the about the mechanism as to how we emerge into our consciousness. Okay, so initially, as a young child, Lacan believes that the child exists in this realm of this imaginary realm, where there is no distinction between self and the other. So here that is like until 6 months, or probably even before birth, from before birth till the sixth month of his time, the child is living in a stage where there is no distinction between self and other, and there is a kind of idealized identification with the mother. Okay, in the first stage, that is in the imaginary stage, there is an identification, an idealized identification with his mother, and he does not seem to consider himself or herself separate. Okay, separate from the mother. Now, in the second stage, there is from 6 to 8 months, he calls mirror stage. Now, this mirror stage is when the child sees himself, sees its own reflection in the mirror, and starts to think of itself as a unified being, separate from the rest of the world. Now, there is a distancing from the mother, not in completely distance, but then he begins to consider itself as an entity separate from the entire world, from the whole world. Okay, now this is called the mirror stage. Now, during this prior period, towards the end of this period, the child enters into the language system which is concerned with lack and separation. See, lack and separation, why? Because language names that which is unnameable, that which is lacking, right? You name a certain thing because it is lacking in some way, right? So it's if you recall our classes on deconstruction, you would remember that the meaning, the signification is ascribed to a particular object, thing, or whatever it is, not because it has an inherent connection to the signifier, but because the signified and the signifier have no inherent connection within them. It is because of the lack of other significations that a word is named in a certain, or a thing is named with a certain word, as in a signifier is named, is worded in a certain way to denote the signified. Okay, so in that case, you have to remember that language names that which is lacking, or deals with the idea of mainly separation, right? Now, this stage marks the beginning of prohibitions and restraints. See, during this period, the child is often told, "Don't do this, don't do that, don't go, don't move about so much, or stop doing it." I mean, it begins to understand the word no. It begins to understand to some extent the prohibitions laid upon him, and the child begins to associate this particular period with the figure of the father because of the prohibitions and restraints. All right, so this new order which the child enters now is called the symbolic stage. Okay, so remember the imaginary stage, the mirror stage, and the symbolic stage. Now, this mirror stage is a transitory stage from the imaginary to symbolic. You just have to remember that it's not a separate stage of its own as such per se, but a stage that is, helps the movement from imaginary to symbolic. So there are two main stages, imaginary and symbolic stage. Now, this distinction between these two is used extensively in literary studies, especially by French feminist critics. Okay, so you see the literary polarization between the realist and anti-realist is quite analogous with the symbolic realm and the imaginary realm. Now, the symbolic would be the realist, while the imaginary would be the anti-realist, right? Because the symbolic realm would have to be seen as one found in realist literature because of its the very logicality of it, the very reasonableness of it, right? This literary realm, that is the realist realm, is quite logical, and hence it would probably resemble the symbolic stage, whereas the anti-realist or the surreal writings or even poetic writing would be more imaginary in nature, because it seems to go beyond grammar and logic. It goes beyond itself, it goes beyond language itself to represent that which cannot be explained, right? And it is a state of idealized identification, as I mentioned earlier. And the imaginary stage is when the child remains in this realm of idealized identification with the mother, and there are no stark lines defining or distinctive lines uh, setting forth the boundaries of a person's individual self. So so this Lacanian outlook will involve preference for the kind of literary text in which there are there are constant eruptions of the imaginary into the symbolic. So the Lacanian critics favor anti-realist texts over realist texts. Anti-realist texts as in surreal texts. They prefer those texts to the realist text, because to them the realist text is far more superficial as opposed to the anti-realist texts. Alright. So what do the Lacanian critics do? They pay close attention to unconscious motives and feelings. They search out those of the text itself. This is another way of defining the process, deconstruction. So the main motive of the Lacanian critic would be to find the unconscious part of the text. Unconscious part of the text. Don't you think it goes very close to the deconstruction? The idea of what the deconstructionist critics wish to do, right? That is, they try to find out how the unconscious motive of the text seem to unravel the text itself, the conscious part. They demonstrate the presence in the literary work of Lacanian symptoms or phases, not phrases. There's a mistake here. Phases. They treat the literary text in terms of a series of broader Lacanian orientations. They see the literary text as an enactment of Lacanian views. So, so they might mainly try to see the instability of a subject. They try to see how the characters themselves cross-question each other, or how there are disruptions all over the novels, how there is a certain disunity prevalent everywhere, and it and they look into the illogical part of the text, because all texts, no matter how unified they may seem from on the superficial level, they are somehow full of discrepancies, full of what do you call it, diversions, divergent ideas that seem to bring in a certain disunity within itself. Okay, so moving on. We're just looking into one of the examples of Lacanian criticism, and to illustrate this point, we're going to use, at least Peter Barry has used, Poe's The Purloined Letter. The Purloined Letter, I believe you're all familiar with the text. We discussed it. We had it spoken of at length last year. So, to briefly recap, there are four main characters, three of whom we actually get to see quite a bit of. The other is merely made mention of. No, we do get to see that person as well. So basically, there is the detective Dupa, the central character, and his friend, who seems to be the narrator, and the king, queen, and the minister, and of course the inspector police. I mean, the police chief, the chief of police, right? So we never get to see the king, but the other characters, that is the narrator, he remains in the background most of the time. He's just narrating the events. Dupa, king, minister, and of course the police chief of police make their appearance oftentimes. So these characters, they are not there is no deep characterization in scene can be observed in in any of them. I mean, like, they're more like chess pieces, and there is sort of like moves, like and the whole plot runs around like each move of a chess. uh, there's attack and counterattack and subterfuge and all of these things, all of these it's seen as a chessboard with all these characters acting as chess pieces. So, to briefly divide it in, I mean, Peter Barry is divided into brief parts, to 4 brief parts. First of all, Minister is in discussion with the queen in her apartments when the king enters unexpectedly, and she has to hide a particular letter from the king, which, when divulged, so she has to conceal it from the king. And when the attention of both is diverted, the minister steals it. In fact, while stealing, he substitutes a fake letter in the place of the original letter. Now, in step 2, what we see is that when the queen discovers and realizes this theft, she appoints a chief of police and his men to search his apartments, which they do very, very methodically, and all the methods of all the methods of I'm sorry for the constant interruptions, which he does, the chief of police does, with very, very minutely, but then apparently they don't find anything. And step 3, the chief of police approaches Dupin's help. I mean, the detective, who is the central character, Auguste Dupin. So Dupin's help. So he visits the minister and reasons that carrying the letter on his person would be a great risk, but its usefulness would be in providing it at any time, producing it at just about any time. So it has to be within his reach. So it has to be in the house but not hidden. So with a series of deductive reasoning, Dupin finds out that the letter is right on the mantelpiece among other miscellaneous items. And step 4 would show that Dupin arranges a diversion, a distraction, and substitutes the fake letter for it, substitutes a fake letter of its own for it. So you see, first of all, the note inside the fake letter reveals that this is Dupin's revenge for something that happened much earlier, something that the minister had done, okay, to anger him. So, in short, to briefly summarize how Lacanian criticism would reflect upon text, we see it in again 2 brief points. First of all, the stolen letter is an emblem of the unconscious itself. That is, the content throughout the story, the content of the letter is never revealed. We are never told what exactly the letter contains, which is of such significance, which has put into motion the series of events presented in the story. It seems to be so significant that it could ruin the relationship between the king and the queen. It could bring in the downfall of the minister. It could bring in the downfall of the queen if revealed publicly. And how the chief of police seems to have exerted so much efforts to acquire it, and how Dupin himself goes through various reasonings, various deductions to deduce its presence, right? So it is very much like, as Lacan says, unknown. They like our unconscious. Like our unconscious, as in the content of the unconscious is unknown. The same way the contents of the letter is unknown. But then this unknown territory, the unknown contents of the unconscious, is what makes us do just about everything, right? It has this great effect. It overpowers all our actions. Oh, it directs all our speech, all our relationships. It seems to be of such vital significance that we are, even without knowing what it contains, what directs us to love someone or hate someone, or feel empathy for someone, or be cruel to someone, or or our reactions to things that happen to us. All of this is unknown, as in living in the unconscious. But just like the letter, the contents of the letter, we do not know its contents. It is unknowable. So you see, Freud's investigation resulted in confident assertions about the precise nature of the content of the unconscious. But Lacan is skeptical about the possibility of such certainties. So, like the letter, the pieces which might make sense of our inner mental universe have been purloined. It has been stolen away. It has been hidden away. It is unknowable. Okay, and we have to learn to operate without them. We have, that is, to use the code without having the key. Now, the second observation is that Dupin's investigation of the crime of the stolen letter enacts the process of psychoanalysis. Okay, enacts the process of psychoanalysis, as in the two techniques of repetition and substitution. Psychoanalysis here would be how you tend to you get to your deepest trouble, or how you help the patient verbalize painful repressed memories. The original event is repeated in verbal form, right? So the patient is made to talk. So that this talking would this talking would help the patient repeat whatever has occurred to create this mental distress in him or her, right? This process of repetition we see in Dupin's action of repeating the process of as to how the minister stole the original letter in the first place. Dupin goes through the same process. He repeats the actions involved, right? And again, there is a process of substitution, as in where in the beginning the original letter is substituted by a fake letter. Again, towards the end, Dupin substitutes the the original letter with a fake letter. So there are processes of both substitution and repetition. Well, in actual psychoanalysis, this repetition and substitution helps in resolving the mental conflict, right? Resolving a mental conflict of the patient. So by the revelation, by these processes, the memory of the patient, which is the cause of all distress, is disempowered. Okay, disempowered, and the mental well-being is restored. Disempowered, as in the hold the memory has on that person is weakened. Okay, so it's the unsaid that makes us fear more, right? It is the unknown that makes us feel more, right? So once you have experienced something, once you have gone through the motions of a certain thing, a certain experience, you feel accustomed to it. This familiarity takes away whatever fear, whatever anxiety you may be harboring about that particular experience. Now, the third point is here. The letter with the unknown content is an embodiment of the aspects of the nature of language. So, just as the nature of language is unknown, the same way the letter is unknown, the content of the letter is unknown. So you see, just as the language centers around endless play of signifiers, there is no actual signifier to any completion of any signifiers. The signified is always lost or purloined in language. The same way, the contents of the letter is, even though it is extremely significant, it does not particularly tell you what it means, right? Not a sign of a specific thing. All words are Purloin letters. So we can never open them, view their content unambiguously. We have the signifiers, which are the verbal envelopes of concepts, so to speak. But these envelopes cannot be unsealed, so that the signifiers will always remain hidden, just like the content of the Purloin letter in Postale. So, uh, just as whatever signifier the language has, it 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 is unknown. It may just be understood in relation to one another to some extent, despite their significance, like the letter in post story, post tale. The letter though is extremely significant, we are never told, it is never revealed what it signifies. All right, so we just live in a sort of assumption. So this is all for psychoanalytic criticism. I hope you understood it all, and if in case you were in doubts, please feel free to ask. Thank you so much.